everyone, it's Sarah, the Tudor travel guide here, and it is wonderful to be back after a bit of a summer break. And in a moment, I'll be introducing you to our very special guest on today's Tudor Talk, and that is Jeremy Ashbee from English Heritage. But before we come to that, just to say, of course, that the subject of today's live chat is all about the Tower of London. Now, gosh, the Tower of London has to be one of the most popular destinations on any Tudor lover's travel itinerary. So I hope you can come along and you've got some questions that you can put to Jeremy, and I'd be delighted to put those to him for you. So in the meantime, I can see that we have a few people joining. So as ever, if you can hear me okay and you can see me okay, make sure you give the thumbs up or a heart and drop a comment in the chat, the live chat here. Of course, you can chat to me as we go along. First of all, maybe you could just introduce yourself, say hello and tell me wherever you are in the world. And maybe you could tell me if you've been to the Tower of London before. That would be cool too. So yeah, I've got some people coming through, so here we go. So Cindy is in the house. Okay, hi Cindy, love to see you. Lovely to see you. And Catherine, hi Sarah. Catherine is back in. It's so good to see you. Have you been having a good summer, folks? Have any of you been out and about? Have you been traveling? Has COVID got the best of you? Have you been still in lockdown? I know all over the world things are very different for people. So yeah, just let me know. So who else? We got Cynthia. Hi Cynthia. You're camping in North Florida. That sounds lovely. So is that a camper van? Is that a tent? What are you doing there? And is that usual for you? That'd be lovely to know. And hello, Robin. Hi, lovely to see you. Thanks for dropping by. And Catherine, you're saying was a member of Historic Royal Palaces. The Tower was a real favourite to visit. So yeah, I think it's a favourite for many people. It's so steeped in Tudor history, isn't it? So much drama that went on there. Okay, so as I go, all I want to say is do keep posting your questions. You can post your thoughts, or if you have any specific questions, just make sure you drop them in the live chat. I'll be keeping half an eye out on that live chat and making sure that I put your questions to Jeremy as we go. Now, as ever, we've done a little bit of a technical check here. We're hoping the sound and everything is okay for you guys. Let me know if you are having any difficulties. And just got a few more people joining us. We've got Stan. Hi. Thanks for your great work. Well, thank you very much, Stan, for joining us. That's wonderful. And Gillian, lovely to see you again, Gillian from Milton Keynes. Is it nice and sunny there in Milton Keynes today? Okay, so I think we've got a few people joined now. So I think without further ado, we should press on. And with that, I would like to introduce today's very special guest on Tudor Talk. So here we go. So can I introduce you to Jeremy? Hi, Jeremy. You're live on Tudor Talk. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Great to be with you.
That's great. Now, Jeremy, you and I met, didn't we, in February? We had a lovely morning. I think it was gloriously crisp and sunny, cold morning at Elton Palace, and we were recording a podcast, and we were blissfully unaware that COVID was about to strike us down.
Yeah, we were having too good a time, very clearly, and there was something in destiny that said, okay, we're going to come up behind you and hit you with the lead piping, because it was just the most perfect day. As you remember, the sun was shining, there was frost on the ground, the buildings just looked fantastic. Apart from the fact that there was someone with a chainsaw that was doing a preparation for filming for an advert, as far as I remember, and
How
so actually recording was kind of fun, but we got there. So I'm really glad that the experience was as good for you as it was for me, that you've had me back on for this one.
Oh, yes. Do you know, it's funny, wherever I go, there seems to be machinery or drilling or sawing wherever I go. So, anyway, I'm kind of used to that now. But yeah, no, it's lovely. We spoke about you coming here on Tudor Talk because, well, I'm going to let you introduce yourself in a moment, but just suffice to say that you are head property curator at English Heritage. So, wow, what a job. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and what that means?
Yeah, I can. I mean, it's the titles are always a little bit weird, but I've worked at English Heritage since 2003, and basically what we always say is if it could fall down, I'm in charge of it. If it could be stolen, one of my good friends, the head collections curator, sort of has responsibility. But no, I mean, I have the very lucky job of um, working with some incredibly talented teams of people. One team that does research about the buildings for the sake of looking after them. And then there's another team that we call the historians, some of whom are historians, some of whom are archaeologists, who have the absolutely lovely job, I hope they think so too, of working out what stories we tell to the visiting public, and then we tell them. And so, you know, if you see some interpretation material on a site, or you look at the English Heritage website, or you read a guidebook, or something else of that kind, chances are it'll be one of my guys that do it. I mean, what I always say is I'm blessed with having incredibly able people, as a consequence of which I'm not quite sure what it is that I exist to do anymore, because they could do it so much better without me. But anyway,
Oh,
here I am.
I think that's, you know, I think you're in a great job when you're surrounded by people who make you feel like that about what you do. So, so yeah, well, you must have how many properties then does English
Yeah,
Heritage look after that you're responsible for?
well, we've got 420, and they start with Kit Scotty House, actually very near where I'm speaking to you from now. Actually, I'm in Rochester in Kent, and Kit Scotty is a prehistoric Neolithic burial chamber on the North Downs, and they end with the 1960s Cold War bunker in a back garden in York. So we reckon that we've got, you know, um, the best material for understanding the history of England anywhere. You know, I mean, we are like 420 museums sort of added up, and the properties are fantastic. They tell so many stories. We'd love to have more and actually tell a more diverse set of stories as well, but maybe that's a whole other question.
Wow.
But so yeah, I mean, I do pinch myself sometimes that I have a job, I get paid to do, which I quite frankly, you know, many people would give their eye teeth to.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, absolutely. You're very lucky. And out of all of those properties, of course, we're here to talk today about one which I know is one of your favourites, if not your definite favourite, and that's the Tower of London. So,
Well, I've got loads of favourites, Sarah, but the Tower of London, I should explain.
hmm,
The Tower of London, this is the place where I learnt it all. And English Heritage, my present organisation, doesn't run the Tower of
of
London. It
course.
belongs to Historic Royal Palaces, and they hired me when I was a young, um, growing archaeologist, come down from Lancashire to London to seek my fortune, to go and be one of their historic buildings team. And the other one, the other person that joined at the same time was Jonathan Foyle, who I happen to know you've got coming on a future live.
We
So
do.
say hi from me. We should. I'll give him a call. But
Mm.
I got the job at the London properties, so I was the looking after the buildings of Kensington Palace, the Banqueting House at Whitehall, and the Tower of London. And the Tower of London rapidly, you know, became apparent that I could go many lifetimes and I would only just have scratched the surface. So it's one of those places that can occupy your every waking thought. It was just the most brilliant place to work, and you know, as you say, it's so steeped in history of all periods. So
Mm.
we're going to be talking today about the Tudors, and you know, it's been lovely to have the opportunity to go back again and have a look at some of the things that I worked on, a few years ago now. And I'd be interested to hear from everyone who's listening to this call, whether it all still stacks up, or whether or not there's more stuff that needs to be done.
So I'm just going to pause for a moment because I'm just noticing on the chat that for some reason, and I really don't know why, I think the live chat is freezing for people.
Okay.
However, I think the best that we can do, I'm really sorry, guys. I've no idea why that's going on. It's showing us all okay here. Maybe there's just a bit of a glitch in the internet briefly, but we're going to carry on because whatever happens, this will be on YouTube and you will be able to watch it after the event if you are struggling to watch it live. Oh, and we're back. Excellent. I'm just saying, folks, that I'm sorry if I can see there's some issues with things freezing. I don't know what that's about. We're going to keep going, and you will be able to watch this on YouTube after the event. It will be there in perpetuity. So let's keep going. Okay, so let's then dive in to talk a little bit about the tower. Now, let's start with how people see the tower today, because it is, as I say, one of those just incredibly iconic buildings. And I think particularly if you're interested in Tudor history, you tend to get involved with its more gruesome side. But of course, the tower was built for so much more than that. Maybe you can talk to us about the range of uses of the tower and what kind of modern media has done to shape our impressions of it.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I mean, this is the perfect way into it. And when I started at the Tower in 1996, I mean, I got a number of conflicting viewpoints. First of all, one of my friends said, what the hell, why are they employing anyone at the Tower of London? Surely it's so famous that everything is known, and that turned out not to be right. I had another friend who said something, and I'd be really interested if people think this is about right. He said, well, if you're going to present it to the public, obviously you should make it look like it looked on the day when Anne Boleyn was beheaded. That's sort of, that is the day when the Tower of London was sort of,
Okay.
on its own. And who knows? That's a view that I dare say, I suffice to say we couldn't do it, but that's a viewpoint that I'm sure many have. But then on the other end, as I started to get into it, we had the view of some medieval historians particularly who felt that the sinister legend actually is a bit of myth making, and that it's a debasement of history to imagine, as he put it, the place was built by Henry VIII for the sole purpose of incarcerating, racking, and finally beheading his opponents. And of course, it wasn't built by Henry VIII. It had already been existed for a long time, and Henry VIII did much, much more with it. I think the key to it is exactly as you say. The range of things that happened there are, are very broad. But it's not for nothing that the prison and the place of execution have come to the fore, because, as I think you alluded to this at the beginning, and many writers have picked up on this, the human story is enormous, and the stories of people suffering and eventually sometimes paying the ultimate price. It's not for nothing that these things have actually lasted through the centuries when other functions have been forgotten. So that was a long-lasting thing to say. But Henry VIII, yes, it was a prison. He would have known it, but he also would have known it as a palace. It's the place where, some of the high points of his reign for him and for other people actually take place. That shouldn't be forgotten, and it remained a royal palace. In fact, it's technically still a royal palace. It is called Her Majesty the Queen Elizabeth's Palace and Fortress, the Tower of London.
Is that so?
It,
I didn't know that.
It still is. I mean, we never call it London Castle, but actually that's really what it is. And the fact that it was a very strong building with big defences. It was armed sometimes to the teeth, sometimes not, but there was supposed to be very impressive stores of war, and actually for the use for the defence of the tower. It has a role in commanding London, and that's always been a very important part of its history right up until the 20th century. And then it has a whole load of other really small things, some of which are quite well known and some of which aren't. The royal menagerie, certainly in Henry's time, the king's beasts, the lions, they were the first thing you saw as you entered the Tower of London. The Royal Mint was the second thing you saw in the Tower of London, because much of the outer ward was there as the only place of coinage at all time. And other things, the Record Office, it was the place where all the documents were kept. The embryonic National Archives or Public Record Office was actually at the Tower of London. And later on, it even had things like the Royal Observatory was briefly there. So just to reduce the whole thing to being this hideous prison actually is to do something of a disservice to something that, to onlookers in the 16th century, everyone must have realized that it was a bit more diverse than just that.
Yeah. So it was built primarily. Was it built by William the Conqueror? Is that right? And to defend London, and then it developed these multifaceted uses over time by the monarchy.
Yeah, well, yeah, defend London gets us into some interesting territory, and I would probably put it a different way. So they're actually to keep London, beneath the king's heel a little. And I think that's the important thing, because actually my own researches were primarily about the Middle Ages. I wrote a doctorate during my time at the Tower of London, and partly after, when I came over to English Heritage. And to get that out the way quickly, what I found is that in the Middle Ages, it was the same as it was under the Tudors. It already had a fairly sinister reputation. All of the functions that I just ran through were happening there already. But the big thing was, it was never a popular place. That people always realised that some of its purpose was coercive. And once you sort of realise that, for every state, there are some functions that they need to do in public, and for Henry VIII, Hampton Court is a good stage for that. There are other things that you need to do to keep things running that you don't necessarily need everyone to see. And by and large, those are the things that happened at the Tower of London. Looking after stuff, keeping people that you don't like, disciplining a big and potentially unruly city, and some of the sort of more industrial processing, making the coins work, making the armour, making the weapons of war, and all of those things. And once you realise that actually the Tower of London was this big fortress where these things could happen securely, suddenly everything starts to make a bit of sense, including the prison and how it related to everything else.
Right, so we've got a couple of questions coming through. I'm going to acknowledge them and just read them, but I actually want to come back to them, because obviously this is about Tudor talk, so we're going to be focusing in on that. But Robin wants to know to what degree you believe Anne Boleyn is buried under the altar of the Tower Chapel. So I really want to come back to that and the burials in the chapel at the Tower, and Gillian's asking, and maybe we could dive into this a little bit sooner. Who do you think truly murdered the little princes in the Tower? So that might be your opinion about something. Okay, so maybe we'll come back to those. So if we can think of princes in the Tower and Anne Boleyn,
yep.
we'll come back to those.
Okay.
But before we get into that, I'd really love you to paint a picture of how the Tower looked. And I mean, you've talked about its multifaceted uses, but how did it look during the Tudor period? And one of the parts of the Tower that I'm always drawn to are the royal apartments, which of course are gone now. So I think when I first started going to the Tower, before I completely lost myself in the Tudors, I had no idea that there was this beautiful range of royal apartments. And maybe quite a few people miss that. So yeah, can I hand you that question and see what you can?
Okay, first of all, the most iconic bit of the Tower of London is the White Tower, the keep in the middle of the Tower of London. And everyone, I hope, if you just take a second to conjure up the image of that in your mind. At the top of the White Tower, there are 4 turrets, and those turrets have got what someone once described as pepper pot domes, and I can never get any better than that. They are this sort of rather strange onion-shaped dome thing. That was built by Henry VIII. Those pepper pot domes go on, and they've stayed ever since. There's good 1532 timber underneath all of them. Right. 1532 is a good moment to think about. I mean, you asked what it looked like in the Tudor time, and all I'd say is that the Tudor period is quite long. It goes on for more than a century. But that particular moment in the 1530s is really interesting, and we know a hell of a lot about it because of the famous or infamous Thomas Cromwell needing to, when he was the king's man of business, needing to get the place sorted out. It had obviously been allowed to physically deteriorate a bit, and it needed to look good because they were about to have a coronation, the coronation of Anne Boleyn, which is going to take place in the 1533. Anne Boleyn was going to have to stay in some apartments, the old medieval royal lodgings, which had been around since the 13th century. Some of them looked like they'd been around since the 13th century. They really did not look any good. And all along the riverside frontage, where there was the Great Hall, there were chambers at either end, and then running from one of the towers on the river frontage, the Lanthorn Tower, running north up the hill towards the White Tower, there was another range of apartments. Now, the range that, unfortunately, as you say, for a couple of good historical reasons, they just don't really survive anymore, largely because of fire. The Great Fire of London in 1666 didn't damage the Tower of London as a mercy, but it did make everyone terrified of fire. So a number of Anne Boleyn's apartments were knocked down shortly after the Great Fire in order to actually clear an area around the White Tower which was full of gunpowder, and they really wanted to make sure that there was a cordon sanitaire around it. So that goes, and a road is put through the middle of the fortress between one storehouse and another. The stuff along the river frontage probably would have done okay, but they have another fire in 1774, and they decided after that they were going to knock it all down, and would build an enormous office and storehouses for the ordnance. These are the people that run the weapons of war. A building so hideous that someone in the 19th century said, it has all the charm of one of the great gin palaces of London. It was enormously tall, but it had very deep foundations. And as an archaeologist, I always, went with the idea that we could dig up the royal apartments and find the plan. No, nothing survives. Unfortunately, it's all gone. So there is this hole in the middle of the fortress where there was a quite glittering and rather interesting labyrinthine royal palace where all of these events, these dramatic events, actually took place. It is a terrible loss, and I've often thought if I had, if I had time travel, there's lots of things I'd love to see, but just half an hour walking through the apartments at the Tower of London, the good thing is there are a lot. The Tower of London is famous and it's well documented. So I talked about Thomas Cromwell doing up, or organising all these repair works in 1532. And he's a great record keeper, and so are others. So there's a load of documents that say, to put in a new timber roof and frame for the Queen's dining chamber with a jakes at the northern end and two bay windows on the east side and another bay window on the western side and a stair leading up into it on the south side. Once you've got a whole load of these things, you can start to reconstruct it in your mind's eye and on paper. And a number of historians have done that. So it's not all doom and gloom. No. But there just isn't the stuff to see there when you go now.
But I would point out to anybody listening that I'm sure it's Historic Royal Palaces have done a recreation of the apartments, and it's on YouTube. And if you search for, I think it's Anne Boleyn's apartments, or it's an amazing sort of digital, isn't it, reconstruction, which is as close as we're going to get. But I remember finding that for the first time and be like, wow. This is amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it's ironic, really, that some of the older bits, the White Tower is a building of the 11th century. It's built for William the Conqueror. That's survived with changes, but it survived relatively well. There's some buildings for Henry III and Edward I in the 13th century, but the Tudor stuff, there are certainly. I mean, I talked about the cupolas. Another building on the other side of the Tower of London from the royal apartments is what's called the Queen's House. That's actually Queen Elizabeth II's house. If she ever wanted to use her palace in the Tower of London, that's where she'd live. But being a lady, she doesn't want to do that. So that's now where her representatives, the resident governor and sometimes the constable of the Tower, live. And that's a timber frame building of the 1540s. It's built for the Lieutenant Sir Edward Walsingham. So it's just too late for Anne Boleyn.
Yes.
But how wonderful that is, a timber frame building in London that wasn't lost at the Great Fire.
Well, that's true, yeah.
The building that we often call Traitor's Gate, and I ought to come back to that name a little bit later on, the building that's more officially known as St Thomas's Tower, actually behind the medieval frontage, the interior of that building is a Tudor structure. It's a Tudor timber frame, again built this time in the 1530s by James Needham, the King's Master Carpenter. And again, it's a beautiful piece of carpentry that was fitted up actually as the apartments of two of Anne Boleyn's courtiers over the Traitor's Gate for her coronation. So there's actually, once you add it up, there's quite a lot, but
Yeah.
it just isn't the royal apartments, the bit that probably we all most want to see, because it's the one where so much of the really good stuff happened.
Yes, 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 yes. And there's the jewel house, wasn't there? Which I've loved, fascinated in. When did we lose the jewel house at the same time? So was this where the medieval kings kept their, the crown jewels, etc., and all their plate and wealth?
Well, the crown jewels, okay, no, they move around a bit. Many of the times they're not at the Tower of London. When they are at the Tower of London, they tend to be kept in a whole variety of locations. Sometimes they're in the White Tower, sometimes they're in some other towers. But the jewel house for the Tudors
Mm.
wasn't a medieval structure. It's actually built by Thomas Cromwell in the 1530s
Oh, okay.
against the south face of the White Tower. So it's the same area where the palace
Yeah.
is. It actually must have been full of buildings and really quite, I mean, now it's this broad, expansive open
Mm.
lawn with ravens hopping about on it. It was full of buildings.
Yeah.
Tragically, that goes in the again after the Great Fire. It goes in the 1660s, and the listener, the viewer that asked the question about the princes in the tower might enjoy the fact that it was while clearing out the Jewel Tower and all the other structures against the south face of the White Tower that workmen discovered two sets of bones under a stair that purport that were thought to be the bones of the princes in the tower. They were found in the 1660s and moved over to Westminster Abbey, and that's where they've rested ever since. So this is a good reminder for anyone that didn't know that all periods of history are interrelated. You can't talk about the Tudors without talking. Here I'll go. I've talked about Henry VIII. I've talked about Edward I. I've talked about Charles II. And later on, when we get to Anne Boleyn, we'll talk about the Victorians, because Queen Victoria is actually has an important offstage role in this saga.
So maybe we should talk a little bit about Anne Boleyn, and
Yeah.
before we get to the sad and tragic events of 1536, you mentioned her coronation, and can you? I know there was a huge coronation procession that kind of got lined up for her. Can you try and paint a little bit about that day, and and
Yeah,
the
I can.
ceremony that went on, and etc. in the
I
Tower?
can. And this is another nice example of the fact that the Tudors invent relatively little. That much of the day that Anne Boleyn experienced was a day that her medieval predecessors would also have had. And the big thing is, if you're going to Westminster to be crowned, if at all possible, you should stay at the Tower of London beforehand. Why? So that you can process at the head of an enormous army with all the nobility and knighthood through the city from the East End, the Tower of London, to Westminster, which of course is a separate village in those days,
Mm.
off towards the West End. You get to show yourselves to all the Londoners, and they get to do pageants for you and to shout "God Save the Queen" and all that lot. And even before you get to go on this procession, you do this strange ritual, which it takes about a day and a half to do, called the ritual of making knights of the bath. And this happened for Henry VIII at his coronation. It happened for Anne. It happened to various others, in which the most up and coming young men, so Sir Francis Weston, he's going to come back in this story too, he's among them, and about 25 others, get to be initiated into the order of knighthood by this ritual, the Knights of the Bath, which at the centre of which involves going into the White Tower, the oldest bit of the fortress, built by as I say, by William the Conqueror, and a desperately uncomfortable and dark and miserable building in which baths would be set up in a line in one of the big chambers, and the knight would get his kit off, would go and sit in the bath, and be instructed into the duties of knighthood, to be, to relieve oppressed maidens, to be supportive of the Holy Church, to honour thy sovereign lord the king above all things, while some other numpty is splashing water over you. And it's a bit like a baptism, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
And then after you get out, you then get dressed up in very plain vestments like a hermit, and you have to kneel in vigil all night in the chapel. And then you get to go, you put on your finery, including spurs. You get to go to a banquet in the Great Hall of the Tower of London, which you are, by the way, not allowed to eat. You just have to stand there.
Oh,
Looking
really?
like a bit of a lemon while other people do it. And an anthropologist could have great fun with this, that you get your status by basically being humble, by showing that you are, not going to get too uppity, and you will stick to the rules. you get to be inducted into the Order of Knighthood, and then you get to go and ride with Anne in this big procession through London. Of course, she's expecting at the time, so it's a bit of an ordeal for her, but she goes through with it, and it must be that the high point, if you like, of her fortunes. They've been so long. This has been so long coming. Henry has wanted it so much, and she plays the game, very, very, very cleverly. And this day comes, and it's a glittering day, and the Tower of London smells of fresh paint. Everything has been, got in its place. The gardens have got ornamental bridges and king's beasts and veins on all this kind of stuff. It really does look wonderful, and the ordnance go bang, and the trumpeters play and all that. As the yeoman warders in their tour then do, not very long afterwards, Anne would come back, but under very different circumstances, and then they pause. Quite a lot.
Yes.
That's where the story comes. But crucially, it's the same Tower of London, and it's the same bits of the Tower of London that get involved.
Yeah.
Famously, as she comes into the fortress, the constable Sir William Kingston meets her, and she says, "Am I to go to some dungeon?" And he says, "No, madam, you go to the chambers whereat your grace lay before your coronation." The place that had been associated with the height of her fortunes is now going to play a part in the last grisly days of her downfall.
So we've definitely got questions coming about maybe your opinions on different things, and so maybe I'll just, since we've got on to talking about Anne's story and Anne being accused as she was of all sorts of different things, just to ask your opinion about a couple of things. So I'm just going to drag over Stan. Oh, will that come up? Yes. So how justified were the accusations of Anne Boleyn of adultery, or was it just an attempt of Thomas Cromwell to please his master? What do you think on that?
Well, I think I am not an expert, so I don't know, but I don't read too many people that think that there's any truth in it at all. I mean, I think Anne, hers is a story that where you can see that she had offended many people, and that it was in various people's interest to get rid of her. But it sounds so lurid that I've never really given any great credence to it. I would imagine that's a view that you would share, Sarah, but that also that yes. Many others.
I think basically, I think most people think that is, it was a trumped up charges conspired by Cromwell when his back was a bit against the wall. Really, it was a very, very clever bit of political shenanigans on his part, and he pulled it off rather well, unfortunately.
I mean, I've never checked this, but the version that always goes out that it really was a stitch-up job, that the executioner from Calais was on his way before the verdict was in for the trial. I mean, that if that's true, and I've always believed that it was, isn't that rather telling?
Yes, I think it probably is. We are definitely going to come back to the Anne Boleyn story, but I also just wanted to ask another couple of questions. So, Catherine, I'm going to drag your question over here. Catherine said, are visitors allowed to view the medieval wall painting of St. Michael that was discovered under the Limewash in the Bywood Tower? I think it is where staff live, so likely private.
Yeah, well, I don't think there's no one. Okay, yes, it's a good question. The answer is I think you have to make prior arrangement with the authorities of the Tower of London, and they will find someone to take you in, because they certainly keep the room clear. And the last time I went in was earlier was late last calendar year, and they have this very nice carpet which protects the medieval floor tiles underneath, which is photographically printed to look like the medieval floor tiles, but it's springy underfoot, so you're not doing any damage. Yeah, I mean, anyone who's never heard of this, it's not Tudor. It is simply one of the most beautiful things that I know of in this country. Anyone who knows the painting, the panel painting in the National Gallery, the Wilton diptych, it's in that style. It's the style of the late 14th century, and it's the remains of a wall painting, almost certainly of a crucifixion, where there are four fragmentary saints: St. John the Baptist, the Virgin Mary, St. John the Evangelist, and St. Michael, the Archangel, weighing the souls of the Last Judgment. What we've lost is the bit in the middle, and it's almost certainly a crucifixion. Why have we lost the bit in the middle? Well, thank you, the Tudors. There was something that I'm not very pleased with the Tudors about. doubtless not knowing that this wall painting was there, they shoved a brick fireplace through the middle and painted a Tudor rose on top of it. So
Ah,
the central icon has gone. But it is a very beautiful
the-
thing. My theory, and that one of the curators at the Tower, Jane Spooner, took it a lot further than I ever got to, was that it was connected with the Royal Mint, because the business about weighing things in the balance, weighing souls, weighing gold coins, this is all part of their business. And certainly it's in the part of the Tower of London where the Royal Mint administrators were based. So I think that's what it's about. Yeah, anyone who can make contact with the authorities before visiting the tower would be well advised to do it, because it is a lovely thing.
well, that's great. Who? I mean, I know there are going to be people thinking, who do I contact exactly? So,
Well, really don't know. I mean, because something that I hope we would come back to towards the end. I mean, the Tower of London is not having a wonderful time of it at the moment because of the COVID-19 situation and international tourism. So, one of the reasons why I really wanted to do this, to raise its profile a bit, is because I know that the present curators at the tower, some of them are on furlough and not available. Otherwise, it would be them that would show one. But I think there is, on the Historic Royal Palace's website, I think there are general contact details for the Tower of London, and I'd advise you to have a go with that. That's probably the best way.
okay. All right. So again, I'm just going to a couple of other comments. The moat. Talk to us about a moat, because there's obviously the dry moat now. What would we have seen if we'd have been there in the Tudor period, and from an external view of the tower?
Yeah, okay. You'd have seen, well, you'd have smelt it before you saw it, I suspect.
Really?
What you would have seen is a very ragged edged body of water that at certain times of the day would probably run dry. The moat had been a feature of the Tower of London certainly since the 13th century. And the Tower of London basically reaches its final extent in the reign of Edward the First at the end of the 13th century, and he had a moat. His predecessors had also had a moat, but he had a moat. And Henry VIII, it was certainly still there in his time, and it was there during for the rest of the Tudor period. Rather lovely. Some of you may know there's a quite early plan of the Tower of London made in the year 1597 by two draftsmen called Hayward and Gascoigne, and it accompanies a report made in 1597 for the Lieutenant of the Tower, Sir John Peyton. One of the things Sir John Peyton says is the water in the moat keeps running dry, and it's horrible because all the latrines of London and of the Tower are pouring into it, and it's really bad for health.
Mm.
That situation never got any better. It was supposed to be sort of cleansed twice a day by the tidal action of the Thames, and it never did, because it basically is designed as an oxbow lake, and the main watercourse of the Thames never really penetrated into it. Eventually, in the 1830s, the Duke of Wellington, the Constable of the Tower of London, said, "Look, I've had enough of this. The soldiers are really sickly, and we're just going to fill it in." So they dug it out. They took some of the soil off to Battersea for the market gardeners there. So there's probably
Nice
some
and
interesting
fertile.
archaeology in Battersea where bits of the Tower of London
Oh,
keep turning up.
right.
But the rest of the time it's filled in. And when I first came to the tower in 1996, on the cards was the question of whether the moat could be recreated. I think it's an idea that people still keep coming back to, but it would have cost many millions. It's very hard to engineer. It would have been there. It would have been a quite unpleasant thing for much of the time, but certainly it was a feature of the Tudor Tower.
Right, okay. And we've got another question. You may have already answered this, Jeremy, I'm not quite sure. But Daniel's asking, do you know anything of the demolition in the later 19th century of the much altered Queen's wardrobe beside the White Tower?
Yeah, a little bit. If it was the Queen's wardrobe, and that's a difficult question, because, as I say, the accounts of Henry VIII's reign and later, they are to some extent topographically clear. To some extent, they're not. There was a big building. It survived until the late 19th century. I think it's the 1870s, 1880s, and a royal engineer called Colonel Gordon did a survey of it, and basically it was revealed to be falling down. Its walls were bulging, so down it had to come. And it's one of the many buildings where, again, I think, yeah, it'd be really interesting with the benefits of modern archaeology to actually be able to see it, because it was probably partly a Tudor structure. It was probably partly a medieval structure. But again, very heavily looked over. It worked over in the 17th and 18th centuries, and its last manifestation was as a military storehouse, as an armory, and a place where munitions and uniforms and other things like that were kept.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you for that. So we're going to pick up our conversation of Anne Boleyn again for a moment, and particularly this idea of prisoners in the Tower, which, going back to where we started the conversation, perhaps most people relate the history of the Tower and the Tudors to its kind of gruesome history of incarceration. I thought it might be interesting just to talk a little bit about the difference between low status prisoners, high status prisoners, and what could they expect in terms of
Yes.
the treatment that was meted out to them?
Right, there's enormous gradations about this, and Anne Boleyn is kind of off the scale at the top
Mm.
end. Um, Down at the bottom is pretty grim, but perhaps not quite as grim, maybe, as some people are imagining. Um, I used to get loads of questions when I was a curator, and I bet the present lot do, of people saying, "Where are the dungeons?" They want to see dungeons. And it's a tricky question because the Tower of London's prison accommodation wasn't quite the way that many people would expect it to be. That your the conditions in which you were kept were not entirely dictated by what it was that you were accused of having done. They were much closer to the kind of person that you were.
Mm.
And essentially, if you're rich and you're important, you might end up paying with your life, and many people do, but the days leading up to that are not probably going to be as horrible as you might imagine. You would get one of the you might not even be in one of the medieval bits of the Tower of London. Much of the accommodation for prisoners was in buildings that weren't built as prisons, and many prisoners were kept in the defensive towers around the two circuits of the wall, the inner curtain wall and the outer curtain wall, particularly the inner curtain wall. We know about this because when you go into buildings like the Beauchamp Tower or the Martin Tower, you see lots of graffiti.
Mm.
And that graffiti is really interesting. I'm not aware of anyone that's ever done a really detailed study of it. Some of your listeners may be able to prove me wrong. But certainly the upper floor of the Beauchamp Tower is absolutely, there's hardly a surface that's not covered in graffiti, but it's graffito over graffito. They sort of overlap one another. Some of them are so fine you couldn't do them without a certain amount of skill as a stonemason, quite frankly. The idea that someone is just scratching their name with a belt buckle or something else like that, they're much too good for that. They would take a long time to do, they would take a lot of skill, and your warder would surely, if he didn't want you to
Yes.
do it, would stop you.
Yeah,
So
it's always confused
obviously,
me.
some of this was the kind of thing that actually, people were encouraged to do. And we're talking about the reign of Henry VIII. Some of the earliest surviving graffiti is from Henry VIII's reign. So in the Beauchamp Tower, Adam Sedborough, the abbot of Jervaux Abbey, one of the Cistercian monasteries, Adam Sedborough was involved in the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536 and gets brought to the Tower of London and eventually, I believe, is executed at Tyburn. So, Adam Sedborough Abbas Yorival, he carves his name in Latin on the wall. And there's a lot of graffiti, all around the time. These are not dungeons. They're up in the air for a start. They're quite big spaces. They've got latrines. They've got fireplaces. And presumably the people that are in some of those spaces are probably being comparatively well looked after.
Mm.
But the distinction that I always think is interesting, if you sort of take out the Anne Boleyns of the world, who to some extent are exceptional, was whether you were what was called a close prisoner or whether you were a prisoner with the liberty. Now, a close prisoner is under a very strict regime in which they're locked up pretty much all the time, or all the time. They are not allowed visitors. Their privileges are questions like whether they have a fire, whether they have writing materials, whether they're allowed in any way to communicate with people in the outside world. But that and being a close prisoner, of course, would be very disorienting. There's one of the graffiti, and I can't remember which tower it's in, where someone gives his name and says close prisoner, 423 days, thousands and thousands of, how many
Mm,
hours, the whole thing is. Obviously,
no.
it's just incredibly boring and
Mm,
awful. And the story of Thomas More. There are moments where Thomas More is kept as a close prisoner in order to tighten the screws on him a bit, and his privileges get worse. If you have the liberty of the Tower of London, it's in a way it's a bit like having a house arrest. For some people, you're allowed to walk in discrete areas of the tower, so you can walk on the leads and to take the air, or you can walk in the garden, or you just get to walk around in the interior of the Tower of London. And as long as when the bell goes, you're back where you're supposed to be, that's it. Now, I think it was realised, particularly at times of political uncertainty, that this is potentially really dangerous. That people are, that if people are in for uh, for suspicion of being against state security, letting them go where they want within the tower and talk to who they want and all that lot is actually a quite bad thing. So certainly during the reign of Philip and Mary, there's lots of hand wringing about, I think, the prisoner, the privilege of being a close prisoner should be withdrawn. But like, for example, Elizabeth,
yes, I was
Princess
just thinking.
Elizabeth, when she's in,
Yeah.
she she to some extent has liberty. She's
Mm,
allowed to walk in the garden, but only under escort. So they're very careful about, no one is allowed to talk to her, and all her clothing, is searched all the time to make sure there's no messages coming. And the Lieutenant Bedingfeld is always being told what to do with Elizabeth, but she is allowed to go for a walk, and so famously is Robert Dudley. And there's always the possibility that they may actually have taken exercise together while they were
mm, mm.
prisoners in the Tower of London.
And
So
and Anne Boleyn, was she a close prisoner?
yeah, I think she's allowed to walk a lot within the apartments. What I can't remember is I don't think she's allowed to see other people apart from the officers of the Tower of London. I'd need to check
Mm,
that. I can't really remember,
I
and I
don't.
don't think she gets to walk in the garden either. I think
Mm,
she gets the run of the apartments, which is exercise up to a point, but they're not that huge. The
yeah.
Tower of London is
Yeah.
not that huge
No.
a fortress.
So I know that people have been asking very much about kind of the bones and
Yay!
who's
Okay.
buried in St Peter. So let's talk a little bit about that, because obviously we've got a number of high status prisoners, including Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, and so on, buried in the chapel. So tell us about that story, and particularly what happened during the Victorian period. And where are we
Right.
now with who do we know is buried where?
Okay. The We don't know as much as we'd like to, but okay. A bit of background first of all. I don't know whether anyone's come out and said that they don't know the Tower of London, but just assuming there's one or two people that don't. The chapel that we're talking about is the chapel of St Peter Advincula, which is the parish church of the Tower of London. It stands at the northwest corner of the inner ward, and it's a building of the Tudor period. It's a very beautiful building. I love it dearly. And it's the place where people who were executed either, like Anne and Catherine Howard, inside the Tower of London or on Tower Hill, would be brought back and buried. And there are the information about their burials is by and large not good. It tends to be chroniclers that are writing about it. So always there's the question of, did they really know? But anyway, it's all clear enough that the high-ranking prisoners like Anne and Catherine, and later on like the Earl of Essex, or like George Lord Rochford, or like the Countess of Salisbury, they get buried very close to the high altar up the East End. Because the chapel was the parish church, it keeps being altered and updated to some extent until by the time you get to the second half of the 19th century, it was a bit of a scandal because it didn't really look like a Tudor chapel anymore. And the 19th century is a time when tourism and an interest in history is kicking off for a complicated number of reasons that I could get into. So people are coming to the tower in increased numbers and are fairly appalled at this nasty interior with box pews and with galleries around all sides. And as the historian Macaulay said, this place looks like the meeting house in a provincial market town. It's not good enough. It should look better than that, because the historical significance of the people that are buried in the chapel is too great. Cut to the 1870s, when, as well as people complaining about what it looked like, the building was in dire straits, and particularly the pavements were collapsing. And they were collapsing because of intercutting burials underneath them. And now I have on my table one of my prized possessions, a book that's published by Doyne Bell, who is the Secretary of the Privy Purse to Queen Victoria. And Doyne Bell, the book is called The Chapels in the Tower of London. I bought it in a second-hand bookshop years and years ago. It's got the minutes of the meetings in which they decided what they were going to do and dug up the bones. And the critical day is the 9th of November 1876, when a number of great and good, including a surgeon, a fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons called Dr. Frederick J. Muat, and Doyne Bell himself and the authorities of the Tower of London met at 12:30, just after noon, in the chapel, decided they were going to dig the floor up, dug the floor up, and they'd finished by 3:15. So this is not an archaeological process by any means. They must have gone at it like a bull at a gate. And in as much as we know anything about what lies under that pavement, it's what Doyne Bell and Frederick J. Muat wrote. They knew where they were going to look for certain people. So Anne Boleyn was, they figured she's one of the first ones who's buried with George Lord Rochford, and figured that they would be buried on the north side. And on the 9th of November, they went down 2 feet and found a pile of bones. It wasn't a discreet burial because other later burials had come along and dealt with it. But, I'm going to love this, they describe, and I have to read this out, at this depth, the bones of a female were found not lying in the original order, but which had evidently for some reason or other been heaped together into smaller space. All these bones were examined by Dr. Muat, who at once pronounced them to be those of a female of between 25 and 30 years of age, a delicate frame of body, who had been slender and perfect proportions. The forehead and lower jaw were small, especially well formed. Notice at no point does he ever say, and between the 3rd and 4th cervical vertebra, signs that are very sharp implemented, because it wasn't a whole burial. It was just bits. Then I'm omitting a bit. And then it says, not much doubt existed in the minds of those present that these were the remains of Anne Boleyn. Well, there you go. I mean, they believe what they wanted to believe. Now, Frederick Muat, he does have more description of the people, and I can just read a little bit because you may enjoy it. The bones of the head indicate a well-formed round skull with an intellectual forehead, straight orbital ridge, large eyes, oval face, rather square full chin. The remains of the vertebra, the bones of the lower limbs indicate a well-formed woman of middle height with a short and slender neck. The ribs show depth and roundness of chest. The hand and feet bones indicate delicate and well-shaped hands and feet with tapering fingers and a narrow foot. The hands I will just come back to in a minute. They are all consistent, as he says, with the published descriptions of the Queen, and the bones of the skull might well belong to the person portrayed in the painting by Holbein in the collection of the Earl of Warwick. So they really wanted to believe this. Now, Muat was there because Queen Victoria wished him to be there. Queen Victoria had said, yes, you can dig up the floor, but I am appalled at the sound of what you're telling me, that burials of important and royal people had been disturbed. I demand that, first of all, they be treated with respect, what will happen to them in the long term, and that every opportunity to use medical science as it exists at the moment to identify the people should be taken advantage of. You'll love this to do with the hands, and this is the story of the supernumerary finger, where Doyne Bell, in a footnote, quotes Wyatt's life and says, there was found indeed upon the side of her nail, upon one of her fingers, some little show of a nail, which yet was so small by the report of those that have seen her, as the workmaster seemed to leave it an occasion of greater grace of the hand, which with the tip of her other might well be and usually was hidden without any less blemish to it. And then Muat says, it was at first thought that this malformation could be traced on one of the finger bones, but a more careful examination dissipated that impression. So it was a bit of soil. For a moment, they thought that's what they found. So
not quite
here
rich.
it is. And he lists all of this kind of stuff.
Oh, dear.
I mean, rather scarily, there's a lot of reference to intercutting of burials. Rather scarily, they failed to find any bones at all of Catherine Howard. Now, conspiracy theorists might have some fun with this. What Doyne Bell thought was that Catherine Howard, being a relatively young lady, her bones just weren't robust enough and they would have completely decayed in the ground, which sounds a little unlikely to me.
Yeah.
They were just
to leave absolutely nothing sounds...
Yeah. But there are others that continue to be buried there through the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, including officers at the Tower of London right up until the middle of the 19th century. So, it's not surprising that it was all a bit of a terrible mess. When you go now, what you see there is a Victorian pavement, and it has 2 rows of heraldic insignia incorporated into its design and the names of people. So, for better or for worse, we have what we think are the positions of. I think it's I think it's yes, 12 individuals,
12, okay.
including Anne Boleyn and George Lord Rochford and various others. We're never going to know. And what we do know is that, in accordance with Queen Victoria's wishes, the bones were put into lead coffins, put back in the ground in their approximate positions where they'd been found, and then concrete was poured over the top of them.
Oh, wow.
It's which is actually something I'd only realised for the first time reading it again today. It's very interesting.
Yeah, I didn't realise.
No point in trying to look into this one again.
Yeah, Cynthia actually said, I've gone back in the chat. So Cynthia, you'd said, do you think the DNA of the bones will eventually be permitted to be investigated? But I think you've just answered that question for us.
Don't go there. I don't know whether Historical Palaces has changed its views about it. We did used to get asked this, and we used to get asked this quite a lot, particularly also to do with the bones purporting to be those of the Prince in the Tower, which, by the way, are not in our gift anyway. I mean, they are in Westminster Abbey. DNA analysis is a very tricky thing, and these bones. This is not scientific conditions. The bones have been all over the show. They've been handled by a lot of people. So I don't know. It's the science gets better as the experience of Richard III in the Leicester car park has shown. But ultimately, there's a part of me as historian that would like to know, but there's another part of me that actually would rather just leave them where they are. But,
well, can you believe it? We are 4 minutes to the hour. No! Wow.
Sorry, I talk too much.
Well, there is so much to cover. We could have talked about so many other different things. Although 2 people did ask, so I'm just going to ask for your opinion. Who did kill the princes in the tower?
Richard III. Next.
Okay. There you go.
I don't know, but he had first crack at it. He had every reason for them to die, as far as I can tell. So.
Okay. So for the couple of people who wanted to know, we have Jeremy's thoughts on that. So
okay, one last thought. If he hadn't killed them, Henry VII doubtless would have done, but I don't think Henry VII got the chance.
Okay, thank you. So well, I think hopefully I've answered many or pulled across many of the questions that people have been asking. If I didn't manage to ask your questions, my sincere apologies. Time always just flies through when we do these live chats. But I just wanted to thank you, Jeremy. Thank you so much for coming on to Tudor Talk today and to sharing all your passion and knowledge for the Tower with us.
Well, look, thank you so much, Sarah, for asking me, and thanks for everyone. And, to indulge me going down memory lane. As I say, it's a place where I haven't worked for a long time, but it still has a really strong place in my affections. And, but we all think that it's so iconic that it'll be with us forever. Actually, I've really missed it, and I look forward to. I mean, it's open again now to visitors, and I would strongly commend everyone to do what I shall do. The first possible opportunity is to go back and have another nose around, because it really does deserve it.
And it does deserve it. And as you were pointing out, the heritage sector has had quite a tough time. So the more we can all support these historic sites at the moment, I know it's not possible for everyone, but the more we can, the better, because they need our support at the moment. So thank you for that, Jeremy. And all I'm going to do now is I just want to close up with a few words to folks. So thank you so much for joining us. So guys, just a couple of minutes just to say a couple of things. First of all, thank you so much for coming on to the live chat today. It's been great to see old friends and also to see some new people joining. So that's been brilliant. Thank you so much. So Robin, I'll be listening again to this. I thought I knew so much, but there's always more to learn. Isn't that the case? Believe me, yes. And Gillian, a big thank you to Jeremy and Sarah for a wonderful Saturday afternoon. So very interesting. Such a beautiful place to visit. That's fantastic. And Stan, you're asking me, have you got plans to invite Simon Thurley to cover more on Tudor architecture? Simon Thurley is one of my heroes. I would love to have Simon Thurley on Tudor Talk, so I might have to keep working on that one. He's very, very busy though, so not easy to get hold of. So I just want to say a couple of things. First of all, if you are not aware, I have a podcast called The Tudor Travel Show. First of all, Jeremy and I, as you heard me mention, did a podcast about Eltham back in, well, it was recorded in February. I think it was released around May time. So if you want to hear more of Jeremy talking about another English heritage property, then do go to the Tudor Travel Show. So it's on Podbean, it's on Apple Music, it's on Spotify, iTunes, etc. Just search the Tudor Travel Show, and you'll be able to find Jeremy's episode if you scroll back through older episodes. But this month I also wanted to give a big shout out to a very special month. I'm doing a whole Mary Queen of Scots month this month, so if you've been following me on social media, you'll know I've been gallivanting around Scotland in the footsteps of Mary Queen of Scots, doing lots of podcast recordings at some magnificent historic sites like Linlithgow and Stirling Castle and Edinburgh Castle and Holyrood. And so I will be posting a podcast unusually once a week rather than once a month through September. So I hope you're going to join me on my travels. The first show went live today. So if you head on over to it's the tudortravelshow.podbean.com on any of those channels I mentioned, then you'll be able to see it right up there at the front. And then I think the final thing to say is I am back next month. So we do one of these live chats a month with a special guest. And next month it's Jonathan Foyle. Jonathan is another favourite of mine. Many of you will know that I got involved in the discovery of the Anne of Cleves heraldic panels. Jonathan came on board as part of that team. And so I've known Jonathan for a little while, and he's going to be talking about the marriage bed of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. So that will be fantastic and fascinating. What an incredible artifact that is. So it's the first Saturday of October. I hope that I will see you then. Of course, make sure you look out for postings on social media to tell you that the talk is coming up. And if you're not already on my mailing list, then you can sign up via my blog at thetudortravelguide.com, and there will be some lovely freebies if you sign up as well. So, yeah, I think that's it, folks. Have a lovely evening, afternoon, morning, depending on where you are in the world. And I look forward to seeing you on the road, virtually or otherwise. Okay, take care. Bye for now.